Hello, everyone. Today is May 29th, 2018, and on this day, and likely every day that follows, it is a crime in many places of the world to criticize Jewish people. We can criticize Christians, we can criticize Hindus, Buddhists, Sikhs, we can criticize Muslims, we can even criticize atheists, but the one group that we are not allowed to criticize, at least not without repercussions, are the Jews. We're told that no matter what that group of people does, if we speak out about it, we are engaging in hate speech. And any criticism of the ideologies of Zionism or the political policies of the State of Israel, that constitutes anti-Semitism. Now, while some say that no group of people in the history of the world have been as persecuted as the Jews, some would argue that no group in the history of the world has been as well protected as the Jews. In many countries, criticizing them is a crime that can carry a jail sentence. How many groups of people have ever enjoyed that kind of protection? The United Nations took lands away from a native people, declaring them to belong to the Jews for their own state. Today, that state receives a quarter of its operating budget from the United States taxpayer. It's armed to the teeth by U.S. tax dollars. It is defended from outside invasion by the might of the U.S. military itself. So, persecuted or protected? Maybe both. The answer is in the eye of the beholder. Well, I think it is important that we talk about this. I think it's important for people to understand the true history of the State of Israel and how it came about, because Israel plays such a significant role in today's world events. So I'm going to take you on a journey of discovery. We're going to talk about it. I encourage you to not just listen, not just take my word for what I'm about to say. Do your own research. You'll find your own answers. I believe that if you do your own research, especially when there's something I say that you're not certain about, I think that if you look it up yourself, you will find that the information I'm giving you, that I'm presenting, is fair and an accurate representation of real history, some of which has been purposely suppressed. To begin this discussion, what I want to do is to read some of the words of one of the most respected figures in modern history, and that is Sir Winston Churchill, the famous, or you may say infamous, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom during World War II. Now, while I'm not personally a fan of Churchill, I think that using his words on the subject of the world's Jewry is interesting. I think it's enlightening. Way back on February 8th, of 1920, the Right Honorable Winston S. Churchill had a lengthy article that was published in the Illustrated Sunday Herald. The title of the article was Zionism versus Bolshevism, a struggle for the soul of the Jews. It's a rather long piece, so I'm just going to read some excerpts from it. As you listen, I want you to try to determine from his own words whether or not Churchill supported the Jews, or if he opposed them. Try and deduce what Churchill's position might be. Here's the article, quote, "Some people like Jews and some do not, but no thoughtful man can doubt the fact that they are beyond all question the most formidable and the most remarkable race which has ever appeared in the world. The conflict between good and evil, which proceeds unceasingly in the breast of a man, nowhere reaches such an intensity as in the Jewish race. The dual nature of mankind is nowhere more strongly or more terribly exemplified. We owe to the Jews, in the Christian revelation, a system of ethics, which, even if it were entirely separated from the supernatural, would be incomparably the most precious possession of mankind, worth, in fact, the fruits of all other wisdom and learning put together. On that system, and by that faith, there has been built out of the wreck of the Roman Empire the whole of our existing civilization. And it may well be that this same astounding race may at the present time be the actual process of producing another system of morals and philosophy, as malevolent as Christianity was benevolent, which, if not arrested, would shatter irretrievably all that Christianity has rendered possible. It would almost seem as if the gospel of Christ and the gospel of Antichrist were destined to originate among the same people, and that this mystic and mysterious race has been chosen for the supreme manifestations both of the divine and the diabolical. At the present fateful period, there are three main lines of political conception among the Jews, two of which are helpful and hopeful in a very high degree to humanity, and the third absolutely destructive. First, there are the Jews who, dwelling in every country throughout the world, identify themselves with that country, enter into its national life, and while adhering faithfully to their own religion, regard themselves as citizens in the fullest sense of the state which has received them. Such a Jew living in England would say, "I am an Englishman practicing the Jewish faith." This is a worthy conception and useful in the highest degree. The national Russian Jews, in spite of the disabilities under which they have suffered, have managed to play an honorable and useful part in the national life even of Russia. As bankers and industrialists, they have strenuously promoted the development of Russia's economic resources. In violent opposition to all this sphere of Jewish effort, rise the schemes of the international Jews. The adherents of this sinister confederacy are mostly men reared up among the unhappy populations of countries where Jews are persecuted on account of their race. Most, if not all of them, have forsaken the faith of their forefathers and divorced their minds all spiritual hopes of the next world. This movement among the Jews is not new. From the days of Adam Weishaupt to those of Karl Marx and down to Trotsky in Russia, Bela Kun in Hungary, Rosa Luxemburg in Germany, and Emma Goldman in the United States, this worldwide conspiracy for the overthrow of civilization and for the reconstitution of society on the basis of arrested development, of envious malevolence, and impossible equality has been steadily growing. It played, as a modern writer, Mrs. Webster, has so ably shown, a definitely recognizable part in the tragedy of the French Revolution. It has been the mainspring of every subversive movement during the 19th century. And now at last, this band of extraordinary personalities from the underworld of the great cities of Europe and America have gripped the Russian people by the hair of their heads and have become practically the undisputed masters of that enormous empire. There is no need to exaggerate the part played in the creation of Bolshevism and in the actual bringing about the Russian Revolution by these international and, for the most part, atheistical Jews. It is certainly a very great one. It probably outweighs all others. With the notable exception of Lenin, the majority of the leading figures are Jews. Moreover, the principal inspiration and driving power comes from the Jewish leaders. In the Soviet institutions, the predominance of Jews is even more astonishing, and the prominent, if not indeed the principal, part in the system of terrorism applied by the extraordinary commissions for combating counter-revolution has been taken by Jews, and in some notable cases, by Jewesses. The same evil prominence was obtained by Jews in the brief period of terror during which Bela Kun ruled in Hungary. The same phenomenon has been presented in Germany, especially in Bavaria, so far as this madness has been allowed to prey upon the temporary prostration of the German people. Although in all these countries there are many non-Jews every whit as bad as the worst of the Jewish revolutionaries, the part played by the latter, in proportion to their numbers in the population, is astonishing. Now, I'm going to pause here. At this point, what do you think your assessment of Churchill's statements on the world's Jewry is? He said some good things, said some bad things. Now, but if you're uncertain, don't feel bad. What Churchill is doing here is presenting a balanced look at the issue, which is something that a lot of people are emotionally and intellectually incapable of doing. We look at today's world, political, social dialogue. If a person disagrees with somebody on one point, it's assumed that he has to disagree with that person on all points. For example, yesterday, I spoke up in defense of Tommy Robinson for being silenced over his reporting on the epidemic of rape against English children by men from Islamic countries, from North Africa, from the Middle East. And this resulted in an onslaught, a surprising onslaught of hateful and venomous and profane comments by a significant number of my viewers who said I was wrong to defend Robinson. Why? Because Robinson holds views that favor Zionism. It didn't matter to these people that the man's views on Zionism were in no way relevant to the issue of his criticism of the rape of children. These viewers took the position that no words of support can be given to a Zionist, even if that person is engaged in some worthwhile cause unrelated to Zionism. It seems these people lack the emotional security to stand in solidarity with somebody they disagree with, even if that means the person is defending children from violent rape gangs. You can't stand with him in solidarity with that. Why? Because he's a Zionist. In today's society, a lot of people prefer to live in echo chambers. They surround themselves with only those views that reinforce their own positions, their own biases. But that's not how I choose to live. I believe that a sign of emotional intelligence, emotional strength, is one's ability to hold two opposing views in his mind simultaneously in order to glean as much truth, as much information from both sides of the issue to give himself a unified perspective as much as possible. It does no harm to my position to openly consider the opinions of another person. It's about balance. And a balanced view of the Jews is what Winston Churchill was attempting to present. That's why he is both, on the one hand, extolling the Jews, praising them, and at the same time criticizing them. His primary position was that there are good Jews and there are bad Jews. And among the bad Jews, there are some horribly diabolical ones who are part of a worldwide conspiracy that threatens the very existence of our civilization as we know it. Now, while I think that Churchill's overall picture of the Jews is a fair assessment, here's where I disagree with Churchill. I disagree with his position on how to deal with this Jewish conspiracy because I think it's contrived. He takes the firm position in this article that to prevent this alarming growth of power and the might of the Bolsheviks, of the Bolshevik Jews in Russia, that what you have to do is support an opposing faction in this Jewish movement, which is the Zionists. Churchill essentially argues that we have to enable Zionist Jews to fight against the Bolshevik Jews. And let me read just a little more from his treatise on this. He says that, quote, Zionism offers the third sphere to the political conceptions of the Jewish race. Of course, Palestine is far too small to accommodate more than a fraction of the Jewish race, nor do the majority of national Jews wish to go there. But if, as may well happen, there should be created in our lifetime by the banks of the Jordan a Jewish state under the protection of the British Crown, which might comprise 3 or 4 millions of Jews, An event would have occurred in the history of the world which would, from every point of view, be beneficial and would be especially in harmony with the truest interests of the British Empire. Zionism has already become a factor in the political convulsions of Russia as a powerful competing influence in Bolshevik circles with the international communistic system. The struggle, which is now beginning between the Zionist and Bolshevik Jews, is little less than a struggle for the soul of the Jewish people. It is particularly important in these circumstances that the national Jews in every country who are loyal to the land of their adoption should come forward on every occasion, as many of them in England already have done, and take a prominent part in every measure for combating the Bolshevik conspiracy. But a negative resistance to Bolshevism in any field is not enough. Positive and practical alternatives are needed in the moral as well as in the social sphere, and in building up with the utmost possible rapidity a Jewish national center in Palestine, which may become not only a refuge to the oppressed from the unhappy lands of Central Europe, but which will also be a symbol of Jewish unity and the temple of Jewish glory. A task is presented on which many blessings rest. And that's how he ends the article. Now, what the second half of his article reveals is that Winston Churchill was a Zionist, and a staunch one. So let me share just a few points about Churchill that you may not know. I find this fascinating. I love history. These are points that will help to explain why Churchill was so supportive of the Zionist movement and the role that he played in bringing about the State of Israel. Winston Churchill's father, Lord Randolph, maintained a very close circle of powerful Jewish friends. And that's a circumstance that young Winston observed when he was a child. One of those Jewish bankers was Sir Ernest Cassel. Churchill was indoctrinated at an early age with principles of Zionism. He was taught that a non-Jew such as himself could bring great blessings on himself by being supportive of the Jews. Do for the Jews and you get something in return from God. It's the same kind of Zionist propaganda that inspired the Scofield Bible, which gave birth to the Christian Zionist movement in America. Well, among his father's closest friends were members of the powerful Rothschild family, the Rothschilds themselves. In fact, when Winston's father passed away while he was still a boy, Winston was looked after by his father's Jewish friends. Sir Cassel not only took care of the boy's finances when he was young, but actually continued to manage Churchill's finances for free throughout his entire adult life. And it was the Jewish Rothschilds who personally intervened to help Winston get his first job. These Jews helped Winston to get his start in politics as well. When he was first elected to the British Parliament, a third of Churchill's constituents were Jewish. At the time, there was and here's how it came about partly, there was this bill in Parliament that put restrictions on how many Jews could immigrate into the United Kingdom. And the Jews didn't like that. They didn't like the immigration restriction. So Churchill promised them that if they would vote for him, if they would put him in office, he would get in there and he would oppose this bill. And so the Jews threw their support behind Churchill. And of course, having the backing of the powerful Rothschild family was helpful as well. Now, in those early political days, Churchill formed an alliance with a Russian Jew in England named Chaim Weizmann. Remember that name, Weizmann. We're going to come back to it several times. This is the man who went on to become the first president of Israel. Well, Churchill constantly lobbied the British government to create a Jewish state in Palestine. That was his big mission. You all have heard, I'm sure, about the Balfour Declaration, 1917, in which the British government wrote this letter to the Rothschilds declaring support for a Jewish state in Palestine, right? Well, one of the primary brokers of that deal was Winston Churchill. who of course was a Rothschild loyalist. In fact, 3 years after the Balfour Declaration was signed, the British government put Churchill in charge of enforcing the Balfour Declaration and developing conditions for the creation of the Jewish state in Israel. So let's go over a little bit of the deal making that went on during this time, because much of that geopolitical gerrymandering by the Rothschilds and their various puppets in the British government, it set the stage for a lot of the turmoil that exists in the world today. All right, in the late 1800s, the Rothschilds were driving, they were the driving force behind the Zionist movement. They were setting up Jewish colonies among the Native American population there in Palestine. And one of these Rothschilds, Edmund James de Rothschild, he set up several Jewish settlements, and these settlements were called Yishuv. In 1901, some of the Jewish colonists took issue with Rothschild's management of the Yishuv, and so he wrote back in an angry reply, quote, "I created the Yishuv, I alone. Therefore, no men, neither colonists nor organizations, have the right to interfere with my plans." That's Rothschild, Edmund James. The early movement to relocate the Jews. Remember, the Jews were not living in Palestine at this time. Very, very few of them. The early movement to relocate Jews from around the world to Arab Palestine, that was a Rothschild plot from the very beginning, and historical records prove that this was underway a long time before Hitler came along. So the excuse that the Jews needed the lands of Palestine because of how they were treated by the Nazis, that was late-term propaganda to re-energize, to undergird an ongoing Rothschild operation that had already been rolling for decades. I had mentioned earlier that Winston Churchill claimed to support Zionism because the Zionist Jews opposed the Bolshevik Jews in Russia. But what I observed in that article that Churchill did not mention is that in 1905, the Rothschilds had a Zionist puppet in Russia named Georgy Apollonovich Gapon, or Gapon, who led a coup against the Russian Tsar. It failed. They tried and failed. And those Zionist Jews had to flee to Germany for refuge, where the Rothschilds took them in there. But the incident highlights an important point about the makeup of today's New World Order. In past videos, I've gone into detail explaining how the New World Order is organized. While I don't personally ever use the phrase Jew World Order, as I see some people do down in the comments, I don't do that. To me, it just sounds unnecessarily provocative. It sounds unkind. It sounds offensive. But still, the truth is that the New World Order really is largely composed of two competing factions that are Jewish, and that is not a conspiracy theory, though it is, as Churchill himself said in the article I read, it is a worldwide conspiracy of Jews. The New World Order seeks the common goal of global domination through world government, but within the New World Order, you've got competing Jewish factions. Churchill talked about the Bolshevik Jews. These Jews were Marxist Jews. They followed Karl Marx's teachings. Then you've got the Zionist Jews. These competing factions from the early 1900s, they continue to be the competing factions in the New World Order today. For example, George Soros. We all know that he's a globalist. We all know that he's a Jew. But it surprises a lot of people to learn George Soros is not a Zionist. He is staunchly anti-Israel. He is anti-Zionist to his core. He falls into that Marxist globalist camp, whereas you've got powerful Jews like Henry Kissinger and many of the Jews that Donald Trump uses as his top advisors. Those are from the camp of the Zionist Jews. So again, we have to remember Churchill's words. Let me read just a couple sentences here again. He wrote, "From the days of Adam Weishaupt to those of Karl Marx and down to Trotsky in Russia, Bela Kun in Hungary, Rosa Luxemburg in Germany, and Emma Goldman in the United States, this worldwide conspiracy for the overthrow of civilization and for the reconstitution of society on the basis of arrested development, of envious malevolence, and impossible equality has been steadily growing." See, Churchill, what he was doing was engaging in a polemical argument against the Marxist Jews, while himself promoting the agenda of the equally ambitious Zionist Jews. He was very partisan, even though he gave the appearance early on that he was being fair and neutral. He's anything but neutral. Churchill was an avowed Zionist. And let's get back to the history here. If we go to Volume 2, page 497 of the Jewish Encyclopedia, let me read what it says. Quote, "It is a somewhat curious sequel to the attempt to set up a Catholic competitor to the Rothschilds, that at the present time the latter are the guardians of the papal treasure." Now, what does that mean? In the 1800s, the Catholic Pope needed money. And that meant he needed the help of the Rothschilds, because they had the money. The Rothschilds gave several massive loans to the Pope, and as a result of these ongoing interactions and the deal-making, the House of Rothschild became the trustee of the Vatican's wealth, taking control over the financial operations of the worldwide Catholic Church. And today, the Vatican Bank continues to be interlocked in the larger Rothschild international banking system. Now, at this point, I could go back and talk about the Rothschild connection to the Jesuit order and the Black Pope, or talk about how the Jewish Adam Weishaupt ended up becoming a Jesuit who was later hired by the Rothschilds to establish the Bavarian Illuminati and to develop a plan for secret world conquest, which is exactly what happened. But that would take us too far off track in this video, so let's keep moving here. 1906, the Rothschilds have far more wealth than the public realizes, and that's because they hide a lot of it in front companies. So, for example, when the Rockefellers' Standard Oil monopoly in America started to butt up against Rothschild's Caspian and Black Sea Petroleum Company, what the Rothschilds said was they needed to get out of the business, too much competition, so they sold their oil company to Royal Dutch and to Shell, who at that time were separate. But the truth is that the Rockefellers are actually related by blood to the Rothschilds, and they've been working together since the very beginning. The Rockefeller clan, they continue to operate their global oil empire in cooperation with the Rothschilds. And the Rothschilds, even though they appeared to have sold their stuff, they continue to control, from behind the scenes, Royal Dutch Shell. So the world's wars for oil are very much the responsibility of the Rothschilds. Now, let's talk about another key figure other than Rockefeller. There's a Jewish family named Schiff that once had lived actually in the same house as the Rothschild family when they were back in Germany. These two families, the Schiffs and the Rothschilds, they're inseparable in their business dealings. So it's no surprise that Jacob Schiff, the most prominent, powerful Jewish leader of his day, was the Rothschild banking agent here in America. In fact, some historians consider Schiff to have been the single most influential man in American history. Schiff pushed really hard for the goal of establishing a central bank, of course, because that helps the Rothschilds make money. He wanted to establish a central bank in the United States, and from his seat of power on Wall Street, he even helped manufacture a massive financial crisis that ended up ruining millions of innocent Americans, making billions of dollars in profit for the Rothschilds, and providing some apparent necessity for the very central bank he was pushing for. In 1912, in the December issue of a magazine called Truth, it said this about Jacob Schiff, quote, "Mr. Schiff is head of the great private banking house of Kuhn, Loeb and Company, which represents the Rothschild interests on this side of the Atlantic. He has been described as financial strategist and has been for years the financial minister of the great impersonal power known as Standard Oil. So what we have here is a historical record, a documentation from 1912, that it was their assessment that Schiff was the Rothschild agent managing the Rockefeller oil empire through the Rothschild banks in America. Okay, let's move forward. Next year, 1913, the Rothschilds managed to get their puppet, Woodrow Wilson, into the White House. Got him set up as the 28th president of the United States. Woodrow Wilson, one of the worst presidents in U.S. history. He's in my top 5 worst. Well, there was, as soon as he got into power, an Ashkenazi Jew named Samuel Untermyer went and visited the new president and blackmailed him. Untermyer was an attorney, and he had some pretty juicy dirt on Wilson. What had happened was Wilson had had an affair with a married woman back when Wilson was a professor at Princeton University. Had an affair with a married woman. Well, this Untermyer knew about this, had the secret goods, and blackmailed him. He said, look, here's what I'll do, Wilson. I will go pay this woman $40,000 in hush money to get her to agree to not talk about the affair. Because back then, in this time period, sexual infidelity marital infidelity was much more frowned upon than it is today, and it could destroy Wilson's chances of re-election. So that's the deal. But Untermyer wanted something in return. What he said was, in exchange for this favor, Wilson had to agree to nominate someone of Untermyer's choosing when a vacancy opened up on the U.S. Supreme Court. Untermyer was part of the Rothschild network. Now, folks, isn't this story unbelievable? Because we know that no U.S. president would ever use a Jewish attorney to give hush money to somebody he had an affair with, right? I keep telling you guys, history is a repeating cycle, and that's why I love it so much. We can understand the present by understanding things in the past. Well, some notable things happened in 1913. First, Jacob Schiff set up a little old organization called the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL. You ever hear me talk about the Jewish Anti-Defamation League? You know, one of the 2 main Zionist groups that have thousands of censors working for YouTube to demonetize or delete videos like this one. And before I move on, please, folks, if you enjoy the straightforward, honest reporting that I do, I humbly ask for your financial support. Even a few dollars is helpful. This is my full-time job. I do not get paid for most of my YouTube videos because they get demonetized. I provide these videos for free. I don't get paid for it by YouTube because they don't want you to hear the truth about the Rothschilds or about Zionism. In fact, the original purpose that Rothschild agent Jacob Schiff set up the Anti-Defamation League, its primary purpose was to suppress public discussion of this Rothschild conspiracy by slandering anyone who told the truth about what the Rothschilds were doing. They would slander them and call them anti-Semites. Well, today the ADL's mission has evolved to include slander against anyone who speaks out against the Zionist state of Israel. You talk about Israel and you're an anti-Semite. Well, thanks to the ADL, which was created by Jacob Schiff, the Rothschild agent in America. And indeed, these guys were engaged in a conspiracy. When the Rothschild puppets in America managed to force through Congress in 1913 the creation of the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank that Schiff had been pushing for, there was a very famous congressman named Charles Lindbergh who said this, quote, "The act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When the president signs this bill," trust means monopoly. When the president signs this bill, the invisible government of the monetary power will be legalized. The greatest crime of the ages is perpetrated by this banking and currency bill. Talking about the one that set up the Federal Reserve. Well, it passes. And once a Rothschild-controlled central bank has been established to control the money supply in America, guess what time it is? It's time for war. The subject of Rothschild's involvement in the start of World War I is just way too broad for me to cover in this video. So I'll just summarize by making the point that the Rothschilds took advantage of the fighting during the war to infuse the governments of the United Kingdom, of France, of Italy, of Germany, with massive, massive loans that indebted those nations to the Rothschild family, to the bankers, despite those nations being on different sides of the war. The Rothschilds financed both sides to make sure they had enough guns and bombs to keep the war going. The Rothschilds continued to try and control the public narrative all throughout this time because they did not want people seeing how they were involved. And one of the ways they did this was by establishing 3 major European news agencies. And you've probably heard of at least one of them. You've heard of Reuters news service. Well, that's a Rothschild corporation. With the Rothschild news services gaining power, there was a noticeable disappearance of references to the Rothschilds' activities in the news, which is kind of a curious phenomenon that continues to this day. Don't hear too much about the Rothschilds in the news from the mainstream media, do we? Despite their very, very active plotting and scheming in today's world. But again, that is why funding independent reporters like me who work to expose the Rothschilds' operations is so important. So again, I'd love your support. There is much to be said about Jewish control of the American media, and I assure you, the Zionist control of American media was not an accident. It was very much done by design, by powerful people who want to control what information you hear about. Because if you never hear about the role of the Rothschild syndicate in the ongoing wars and the intrigue that happens on a daily basis around the world, are you ever going to criticize them? Are you ever going to oppose them? How can you if you don't even know they exist? It reminds me of that line from the movie The Usual Suspects, where he says, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. And that's the strategy of the Rothschilds. Keep the world from knowing about what they are secretly doing. All right, let's go on. 1916. Finally came time for President Woodrow Wilson to make good on that promise he had made to Samuel Untermyer, because a vacancy had opened up on the court. And surprise, surprise, you know who Wilson filled that vacancy with? An Ashkenazi Jew named Louis Dembitz Brandes. Brandes just happened to be the leader of the Executive Committee for Zionist Affairs, and in that position, the new Supreme Court Justice was also serving the dual function of being the leader and spokesperson for Zionism in America. And Brandes was very much a Rothschild loyalist. Let me tell you the role that Brandes played for the Rothschilds during World War I. On one side of the fight were the English, the Italians, and the French, and on the other side you got the Germans. Okay. The Germans, for the first half of the war, they were totally winning. Not one single enemy had stepped foot on German soil during World War I up until that point. So, hoping to bring the war to an end, in a grand overture to the British, to the French, to the Italians, the German government offered to stop fighting. They offered to let their enemies go without even having to make any financial reparations to Germany, which is pretty standard at the end of a war. The loser has to pay the victor for war costs. The war should have ended. The British were considering it because there was simply no way that Germany was going to be defeated. Germany offered a way out of the war that would allow the other side to avoid the indignity of defeat, to avoid the financial burden of repayments. But remember this, the Rothschild bankers are the ones who fomented this discord to begin with. So of course they want reparations to be paid to their banks in Germany. War is a very lucrative business, but it is less so without those post-war reparations. So they needed to keep the war going. And that's where this Supreme Court justice came in. U.S. Rothschild agent Brandis sent a Zionist delegation from America to the British government, and struck up a deal. This Zionist delegation said, we will bring America into World War I, and they will help you, the British, to defeat the Germans. But in exchange, the Zionists wanted something in return. They wanted the British government to agree to give the lands of Palestine over to the Zionist overlords, the Rothschilds. Now that's a pretty bold promise to make by the Zionists, to be able to get America into a war that at the time no American citizen supported. There probably has never been an anti-war period in American history as strong as this period. Americans did not want anything to do with that foreign war. In fact, Woodrow Wilson ran his re-election campaign with the slogan, quote, "Re-elect the man who will keep your sons out of the war." But the British agreed. They said, well, we need to agree to this. And the Zionists, though, they say, okay, we'll do our end, but we want proof. We want proof in writing that you, the British government, will give us the lands of Palestine. You'll give it over to the Rothschilds. And so what the British did was they drew up an official document indicating that it was the intent of the British Empire to establish a homeland for the Jews in Palestine. And the government document, known as the Balfour Declaration, was actually addressed to the Rothschilds. Let me read this to you real quick. It's real short. November 2nd, 1917. Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Yours sincerely, Arthur James Balfour. Now, I want you to understand, at the time that this declaration was made, over in Palestine, Jews made up approximately 3% of the entire population. If you want to really go with the high estimates, 5%. Jews made up between 3 to 5% of the population. Now, why would the Rothschilds want that piece of land, especially when there are no Jews in it? Well, the truth is the Rothschilds had very deep financial investments in the region. They wanted their own Zionist state with a powerful Zionist military to establish control over the resources of the region. They could use that military to protect their investments. It's kind of like the British East India Trading Company, a terrible force. Well, once the Rothschilds have this Balfour Declaration in hand, they get busy beating the drums of war in America through their news agencies, through their networks, much in the same way that we see different news outlets of today getting fully behind these nonsensical American wars for oil that are waged by whichever stooge is in the White House at the time. Think about it. Democrats claim to be the anti-war people, and they used to be. But we all know that the mainstream media is largely, with the exception of Fox News, is largely a liberal-leaning organization. You would think that if they hate Trump, when Trump goes and strikes Syria or Trump starts beating the drums of war for Iran, you would think that the media would hammer him over that instead of the silly Russian collusion story. But they don't. And because it's not mentioned in the news, the Democrats, who normally would get out in the streets, remember, after Trump was elected, they poured out by the tens of thousands in the streets across America with their signs and their pink vagina costumes to go out there and protest Trump. Well, why didn't they go out there en masse to protest his warmongering? Media control of the masses. That is why the Rothschilds control the media. And so that is what they did back after, in the lead up to American entry into World War I. They controlled the media and started spinning it toward war. Germany had offered its peace armistice in December of 1916, but it only took 3 months, just over 3 months, for America, the nation that wanted nothing to do with the wars in Europe, to enter World War I. Stunning how fast it happened. So what made America change its mind? Well, the Zionists masterminded one of the greatest false flags in history, the sinking of the Lusitania, which resulted in the deaths of thousands of people, including many Americans. And just like with Pearl Harbor and 9/11, the people of America were outraged. They were angry. Their blood was boiling. They demanded vengeance. And it's very easy to manipulate people when you can get them into a high emotional state. And that's why we anticipate some kind of false flag event at some point when the powers that be are ready to go ahead and do the primary war against Iran. We'll see some kind of event because you have to manipulate the ignorant masses when they're in this emotional state. All right, so World War I resulted in more than 41 million casualties. That included 18 million deaths, 23 million wounded. It's one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. And the Rothschilds made a fortune off the war, as did their Jewish banking network. When you go beyond the typical tripe that is said about Adolf Hitler, when you go and I was thinking one of the books was nearby. When you read his words, when you read what he actually said in his own words, what he said was very much in line with what Winston Churchill was saying about the Jews. See, Hitler saw a vast Jewish conspiracy that had ignited this apocalyptic war against the German people so that these Jewish bankers could make a lot of money. He saw it. He saw how the Germans had tried to end the war in a civil way, in a magnanimous way. They had the upper hand, only to see the potential peace thwarted by the Zionist interlopers. Remember, Hitler was a soldier during World War I. He saw it firsthand. And he had also seen the conspiracy that Churchill had talked about that went on in Russia with the Jewish Bolsheviks murdering the Russian Tsar and his family in a bloody coup, and the rise of the communist Soviet Union and the enslavement of tens of millions of people. And there was a significant block of Jewish communists that were even inside the German parliament. And they were trying to repeat in Germany what had so successfully been accomplished by the Jews in Russia. So is it any wonder that Hitler had issues with the Jews? And I ask this not to be sensational or to try and be offensive. I ask it from the standpoint of someone who has majored in history, who comes at this issue from a logical and academic viewpoint. Was Hitler wrong to have concerns with the Jewish threat? Of course not. Do you all know that the feeling that Hitler had, the concern about the Jews, was universally shared? We don't hear that. We don't read that in our history books, but that was the case. I mean, we read it just a minute ago in Churchill's words, but that's what everybody was saying. Do you know that between World Wars I and II, Adolf Hitler was actually the most beloved international figure in the world? He was extremely popular in Britain. He was like a rock star. Politicians wanted to be photographed with him. He was extremely popular in America. You've got Prescott Bush and others like him helping to finance Hitler's rise. And a great deal of support was given to Hitler as he's rebuilding his decimated country. Why? Partly because they wanted to make money, but partly because the outside world knew that the Bolsheviks in the Soviet Union were a threat to everyone. The Jews in the Soviet Union were diabolical, and the world feared them. And they saw Hitler as the most capable leader able to mount an opposition to the Soviets, to keep their dreams of conquest in check. Germany kind of stood there in between them. So they supported Hitler. But the Rothschild spin machine comes along, changes things around, says, oh, you people, what are you thinking? You've got the story wrong. And he managed to start another world war that the Rothschilds did. I'm telling you all, World War II is not what you learned in school. There's a lot more to it. Let's finish up with World War I. It lasted 4 years, from 1914 to 1918. And after the war, it was time for the British government to make good on the promises to their banking masters, to whom they were indebted for the financing of the war. So in 1921, Churchill traveled to Palestine. Accompanying him was the famous Lawrence of Arabia. And they went there to survey the situation. And Churchill found that the native Arab Palestinians were furious at the efforts to displace the Palestinians in order to turn the lands over to the Jewish foreigners. So Churchill needed some kind of help to deal with this Palestinian problem. So he worked out a deal with a powerful Arabian sheikh, a man named Abdullah. Churchill promised Abdullah that if he could help keep the Arabs in check on the west side of the Jordan River that runs kind of down between Israel and Jordan, if he could keep them in check, then what Britain would do would be to create a new Arab kingdom on the east side of the Jordan, with Abdullah himself as the new king. And that's exactly what happened. That's how the kingdom of Transjordan came into being. They created it for that purpose. Churchill thought the deal was a fair solution, but the Zionists were furious because they didn't want just the land on one side of the Jordan. They wanted the whole thing. They wanted the whole region. And he had just given away 3/4 of the lands of Palestine to the Arabs. Well, the Rothschild Zionists didn't just want the lands that they have today. They wanted it all. Made them mad. And Abdullah himself, while he was quite satisfied with the deal, he was about the only Arab that was satisfied. The rest of them, the Arab Palestinians, they were just as angry over the division of the land as the Zionists were. By creating this de facto Arab state east of the Jordan, the Palestinians in the west were going to be displaced by a Jewish state, and they knew it. They knew that was the plan. So a delegation of Arab representatives sent a letter to Churchill, and they included these demands. They said, get rid of any notion of a Jewish state in Palestine. Grant the Arabs a government over Palestine. That's what they wanted. And up until the end of the war, remember, this region, it wasn't a bunch of states as exists today. This was largely a unified empire under the Ottoman Turks. Churchill came in and balkanized the Middle East, and in so doing guaranteed that there was going to be constant warfare between these various factions and neighbors. And it continues to this day. We even see the Kurds are up there quite ticked off about things. But Churchill flat refused to consider the pleas of the Palestinians. His attitude was, these are the vassals of the British Empire. They will do what their overlords command them to do. But I think that attitude over time, I think time has shown how well that has worked out. It hasn't worked out at all. In the early aftermath of Churchill's decisions, the Arabs started carrying out riots to protest, much as we see the Palestinians of today doing at the border fence. This has been a fight going on, the same fight going on for a very long time now. And because from the very beginning, the native Palestinians have been repressed. For example, Churchill helped the Jews to harness the power of the Jordan River to produce electricity for the Jewish settlements. But in the process, it deprived local Palestinians of a water source that they had been using for 2,000 years, actually longer. There were some in the British government who saw these abuses by the Zionists and their puppet Winston Churchill, and they didn't like it. And they introduced a motion to nullify the Balfour Declaration, to put an end to the Rothschild plans to take control of Palestine. They knew this was a dirty deal. One British representative after another rose up in support of nullifying the Balfour Declaration and putting an end to this dream of a Jewish state, which they knew was wrong. They said that the plans were unfair to the natives. They said that the entire operation was going to create an unjust tax burden on the British people. And so this anti-Zionist motion passed by an overwhelming majority in the House of Lords. British Parliament has two houses. You've got the House of Lords and the House of Commons, kind of like we have the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. Well, in the House of Lords, the vote was 160 to 29 in favor of getting rid of the Balfour Declaration and sticking it to the Rothschilds. But this was just the first step. It also needed to pass in the House of Commons. Just like in the U.S. Congress, the bill you have to have a bill pass on both sides. Winston Churchill was able to work his magic on the other side. He persuaded the House of Commons to vote down the motion. And so, but the truth is, time passed, and the British government dragged its feet. Wasn't going to do anything. They didn't want to. And when Churchill was no longer in office, just things went stagnant. 15 years went by. Still no Jewish state had been established. But in 1937, there was a commission called the British Peel Commission. They proposed basically a two-state solution inside Palestine. One for the Palestinians, one for the Jews, each with their own independence. The idea was strongly opposed by Churchill and his Zionist friend that I mentioned earlier in the video, Chaim Weitzman. Their counsel was for the Jews to just hold out until Britain agreed to give them all of the lands without any provision for the Arabs. Stick it to the Arabs. Just keep holding out for something better. Well, the tide turns in favor of the Arabs. And in 1939, the British government actually issued a white paper that put strict limits on this ongoing flood of Jewish immigrants pouring into Palestine, because that was only making things worse. By this time, the Zionists had formed a deadly terrorist network. And I'm not saying this in a hyperbolic way. I mean, just like we talk today about Al-Qaeda being a terrorist network, the Jews had a terror network, a legitimate, bona fide terrorist network that the United States and Britain equally acknowledged as being a terrorist network. They were conducting terrorist operations not only to drive the natives off their own lands, but to try to force the British to withdraw from the region. But that 1939 white paper, it not only put limits on Jewish immigration, it also put a total ban on future Jewish immigration, complete end to Jewish immigration. And that was going to go into effect in 1944. And this white paper was staunchly defended by the prime minister at the time, who was Neville Chamberlain. And so the hope of a Rothschild military state of its own in the Middle East seemed to be at an end. But again, Time and time and time again, what is the cycle? What does the powerful Rothschild cartel do when it needs to break an impasse? When things have plateaued? It starts a war, right? And in response to World War II, through the machinations of the Rothschild network in Britain, Neville Chamberlain, the chief opponent of Israel, was removed from office, and Zionist puppet Winston Churchill was brought back. This time given a political seat in the most powerful position in the nation as prime minister. Fast forward, World War II came and went, and immediately after the war, Churchill lost his position as prime minister. Following the war, the Rothschilds, though, had an even bigger justification for the establishment of a Jewish state. Despite the best and most complete collection of census records, and I've looked at a lot of these, I've studied, I've read books by people smarter than me who have put more time into this than me, that have collated the information. The best records from the time showed that around 250,000 to 300,000 Jews died in concentration camps during World War II. But the Rothschild-controlled media and the many Zionist groups inflated the figure from 250,000 to 6 million, a veritable holocaust of the Jewish people, a group so brutally savaged that there was no other way to rectify the crimes done against them than to create a homeland in Palestine just for them. This was propaganda. And while this propaganda was churning, the Rothschild-backed Zionist terrorist groups increased their attacks, not just on the Palestinians, but on the British, who were also standing there in the way of the Jews taking control. The primary Jewish group carrying out these terrorist attacks was called Irgun, I-R-G-U-N. They attacked Palestinian villages, they burned houses, they killed fathers, they raped mothers, they left a trail of blood and horror that would make ISIS envious. By 1946, Irgun had displaced nearly 300,000 native Palestinians from their homes. Roughly the same number of Jews who died in the concentration camps. But their operations culminated on Monday, July 22nd, 1946. Very important date. Very important event. The British maintained its administrative headquarters for Palestine and for Transjordan in Jerusalem at the King David Hotel. Big hotel, tall hotel. The British had been fighting back against the Jewish terrorist groups in Palestine, and some of their counterterrorism operations were being orchestrated from the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. And one of those British operations was called Operation Agatha. And that included raids on Jewish agencies. I can't remember the names of the agencies right now, but went into these Jewish agencies, grabbed their files, and got the names of a lot of people that were supporting these terrorist operations. And they were keeping these files at the King David Hotel. So with the agreement of the Jewish paramilitary group the Haganah, Irgun carried out a terrorist attack on the British headquarters. Irgun operatives disguised themselves as Arab hotel waiters, as Arab laborers. They went in, they planted a massive bomb in the main building of the hotel with the intent of not only killing the British personnel, but also of destroying those records that could identify the Jewish terrorist leadership that they had gotten from Operation Agatha. Well, the explosion from that bomb, it didn't just destroy the hotel. It massacred 91 people. Not just British, people from multiple nations, including Americans. It injured scores more victims. Bloody, horrible massacre. The Jews attacked Britain. The Jews attacked America. And the government, they decided, it's just not worth this ongoing effort to fight the Jewish terrorists. So in 1947, the British government announced that they are going to be withdrawing from Palestine. And the British mandate ended a year later. On May 14th, 1948, the Rothschilds got their victory. The Jews who had moved into Palestine declared their independence. Now, at first, Britain refused to acknowledge Israel. And 9 months passed. They still hadn't recognized a Jewish state as being legitimate. But with Winston Churchill back in Parliament now, leading the pro-Zionist movement, the British government eventually conceded defeat. They formally recognized the Zionist state of Israel. And Churchill's lifelong friend, Chaim Weizmann, became Israel's first president. And you know who became Israel's first prime minister? The leader of the Irgun terrorist network, Menachem Begin, became Israel's first prime minister. That'd be like taking Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, and making him the head of a new country. Just outrageous. And in that first year, Israel launched a genocidal purge of the native Arab population, with the Rothschilds having financed this massive Israeli military that it had long dreamed of having, building them up with tanks and everything else. The Zionist forces attacked the Palestinian civilians, expelling more than 700,000 people and driving them out of the land. And that's in addition to the previous 300,000 that had been driven out. In fact, the Arabs who were living in Palestine at the time that Israel declared its independence, 80% of the people who were living there then were forced out of Israel. They became refugees in other countries, including Syria, the Marmuk Palestinian refugee place that ISIS loves to slaughter. And I could go into discussing why ISIS, which is a Mossad creation, along with the CIA, targets the Palestinians there, but I'll not digress. But these refugees went into Syria, they went into Lebanon, millions of them in Jordan, or with their descendants. The Zionists sacked nearly 600 Palestinian villages, extinguishing them as their war machine rolled along. They engaged in horrible war crimes, horrible atrocities. They conducted notorious massacres of Palestinian civilians during the Deir Yassin massacre, for example. And I should devote an entire episode just to that one massacre, because according to International Red Cross, the Jews butchered the villagers in Deir Yassin. The Red Cross went in and they counted 150 civilian corpses, including children, that the Jews had killed, just in one water cistern alone. The Red Cross reported that there were corpses strewn in the streets, many of which had been beheaded by the Jews, that had been disemboweled. There's an Israeli historian named Benny Morris, and he noted that there were also, in this massacre, many cases of mutilation. They didn't just kill the people, they carved them to pieces like monsters, like beasts. The Jews brutally raped the Palestinian women in this village. The Jewish terrorists did that. I mean, the Jewish soldiers did that. We can't call them terrorists now. Now they've been legitimized. And to add insult on top of all of this terror, Israel passed a series of laws preventing the displaced Palestinians from being allowed to return to their homes, from being disallowed to reclaim their property. They can't even come back and take their personal possessions that they had to leave behind as they fled from these terrorists. The expulsion of the Palestinians in 1948 is considered by many historians to be an example of bona fide ethnic cleansing. And indeed it was. And the Palestinians commemorate this mass expulsion by the Jews. They commemorate each year on May 15th. May 15th. They call it Nakba Day, meaning Day of the Catastrophe. The leader of the Irgun terror group that massacred nearly 100 innocent people at the King David Hotel, Menachem Begin, he went on to form a political party. The name of that political party is Likud, which continues to this day to be an extremist and racist political party devoted to the destruction of the Palestinian people. Benjamin Netanyahu is the leader of the Likud party. And like the terrorists before him, Netanyahu, who is a former elite Israeli commando with blood on his hands, he today looks for any opportunity to commit violence against the Palestinians. Folks, it is no coincidence that Donald Trump and Netanyahu timed the opening of the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem on May 14th, one day before they knew the Palestinians would be gathering for Nakba Day. Why? This was intended to be provocative. It was intended to inflame the Palestinian people. Extremely insulting. Remember what I said. When you get someone upset, when you get them into a high emotional state, you can manipulate them. So the goal here was to get the Palestinians, who they knew were going to be gathering the very next day after the U.S. Embassy was dedicated in Jerusalem. They wanted them angry. They wanted them to take actions, because that would give the Zionists further pretext to conduct harsh crackdowns on the people and to go in and seize even more territory from the Palestinians than they already have. Truly, there are few regimes on the planet today that are as racist and genocidal as the State of Israel, in my opinion. And I don't base my opinion on my feelings. I base it on historical facts. I base it on the actual textbook definition of genocide, on statistical proof from many sources of a Jewish genocide of the Arab Palestinians. And remember, among the 1 million Palestinians that were driven out of their homes by the Jews, among many of the Palestinians to this day who are being persecuted by the Jews, many of them are Christians. They're not all Muslims. As a Christian, I feel naturally I feel empathy toward all of them, but I can't help but forget that the Jews in Israel are attacking my Christian brothers and sisters. As I reported in detail previously in a different video, it's no coincidence that the wealthiest Zionists, Jewish Zionists in America, including Rupert Murdoch, Sheldon Adelson, it's no coincidence they financed Donald Trump's campaign for president. It's no coincidence that Donald Trump was bailed out directly by the Rothschilds in the late 80s. It's no coincidence that the Rothschild agent who helped to save Trump's empire, a man named Wilbur Ross, has now been made Trump's Secretary of the Commerce and is shaping U.S. policies to benefit the Rothschild syndicate. Don't tell me the Rothschilds don't have control over the U.S. government. It's no coincidence that Trump's administration has more Goldman Sachs and Jewish Wall Street bankers than any administration in U.S. history. It is no coincidence that Donald Trump has placed his Jewish daughter and son-in-law in some of the highest positions of power in the country. It is no coincidence that Jared Kushner and his Zionist family is close personal friends that go way back with Benjamin Netanyahu. Donald Trump is not America first, and I don't base that on my opinion. Again, these are facts. He is a Zionist Israel first president, not an America first president. And his military conquests in the Middle East and his provocative State Department actions in favor of Israel over and over and over again proves it. Anyone who denies that Donald Trump is an avowed Zionist is living in a world of fantasy. Israel has its tentacles all around America. They've got us. The Rothschild network of Zionist neocons infest our government. They infest our government like rats in a New York sewer. People need to wake up and take a principled stand against this network. The worst thing that we can do to the Rothschilds and their political puppets in the U.S. government is to shine a light on them, shine the light of truth on them, turn the floodlights of truth on their operations, to out their agents, to out their operatives, to identify their psychological operations against our people. I am doing my part to the extent that I can. And if you can support me in my effort, I ask you to take time right now. Don't put it off, please. You forget and get on to other things and never come back to it. Take time immediately after this video to go to patreon.com/endtimesnewsreport. Go to paypal.me/endtimesnewsreport. Make whatever donation you feel comfortable with, because with your help, I will continue doing this, exposing these people. I will continue providing information as the best news analysis, the best geopolitical information, the most accurate information that I can. It's important for people to know what's really going on in the world. You won't get it from the mainstream media, but I will do my best to bring it to you. Please share my videos. I'm asking for your help in doing that. Thank you all for watching. For Blackstone Intelligence, I'm Jake Morphonios.